neighbouring countries in an attempt to halt the slide into violence, which many fear may descend into civil war. The African, Caribbean, Pacific EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly sitting in Brussels has been discussing the situation in Burundi. Some are saying the European Union should impose sanctions against Burundi. Joining us live from Brussels is our correspondent, Jack Parrock. Good evening, Jack. What measures can the EU realistically impose, and will they help to solve the crisis in Burundi?
Well, indeed. So this Parliamentary Assembly that sat today is a meeting of MEPs from the European Parliament and African representatives as well. It's their kind of place for them to get off their chest what they want to say. And there was some hope from the European side that they would have a joint resolution with their African partners to try and put pressure on the member states of the European Union to impose sanctions on Burundi. Now, there are some sanctions on individuals who have taken part in this disputed Burundian election, but at the moment there aren't any broad sweeping sanctions, which is what some of the European members of Parliament wanted. They couldn't put that pressure on because some of their African counterparts weren't up for that, but there is some major concerns here that the situation in Burundi could be spiralling out of control, and that they want to do everything they can to try and impose some force on the Burundian government to come to a political solution so that the refugee flows stop heading out and so that there are less reported deaths, obviously.
Jack, let's look at these sanctions specifically. What potential sanctions could we see being imposed on Burundi?
Well, it could be economic sanctions, so preventing trade through the EPA's economic partnership agreements, and also just preventing people from travelling there, and diplomatic sanctions across the board. Now, it's not clear exactly what those sanctions would include, but essentially they would cut off some of the trade from the European Union and aid and humanitarian funding. But the concern is from many observers that cutting such funding would only plunge the people of Burundi into more uncertainty and leave them facing more difficulties. So there are worries about that, but some of the politicians, the European politicians, are saying something has to be done to force Pierre Nkurunziza, the Burundian president's hand, into either stepping down or coming to a more preferential diplomatic and political compromise from their point of view.
Now, Burundi also has a seat in the Assembly. What did they have to say in this debate?
So I've just spoken to the Burundian representative, in fact, and he said that what the Europeans are trying to do is not fair. It doesn't come under the Arusha agreement that was agreed to try and keep these kind of diplomatic situations secure. And they insist that Pierre Nkurunziza's third term is fair, that he was elected in for his first term under the auspices of his party, and that therefore this is only his second term under his own name, which would be constitutional. But the European parliamentarians, some of them at least, don't agree with that. So it was an interesting debate between the African sides. Some of the African countries are insisting that imposing sanctions on Burundi will not help, and that Uganda specifically, with President Museveni of Uganda saying that he will take charge and take the mediating role between the two sides in the dispute in Burundi. They say that those diplomatic discussions must be given a chance, and any kind of snap decisions by an external factor like the European Union could only complicate and negate those kinds of discussions.
Now, Jack, you've just mentioned that some of the African representatives are saying that sanctions might not be able to help the situation. What are the African representatives saying will help the situation, just going beyond the discussions that are happening at the moment?
Well, they push essentially diplomatic discussions. It's only 12 years since Burundi came out of a civil war, and 2 years ago, Burundi was considered a nice, safe country in East Africa, doing well, economically not too bad. And so there's some shock that this situation has come to pass, that it's so difficult, but there's also an acute awareness, I think especially among the African nations, that a lot of them have said that this is an African problem that must be sorted by Africans. These divisions within Burundi are ones that aren't only there in Burundi, but they exist across East Africa, and that the people of that region are the ones that are going to be able to really resolve this crisis. But the Europeans are concerned that they don't want to stand by like they were accused of. A lot of the members of the Western nations were accused of standing by during the Rwandan genocide less than 20 years ago or so. So they're keen that they are seen to be doing something. So it's a difficult situation, and that's why there was no consensus among the Assembly.
Before I let you go, Jack, now the meeting today was also expected to discuss the issue of migration. Were there any resolutions taken regarding the migration crisis?
Not at the moment. This all comes off the back of the Valletta summit between African and EU leaders only a month ago or so, to discuss how the African flows of refugees are affecting the European Union. But the discussions and the emergency discussions on Burundi really took over this debate, and it's likely that the migration and refugee crisis will be pushed into further discussions.
Some interesting developments coming out of that debate. Thank you so much, Jack. We'll have to leave it there. That was our correspondent Jack Parrock joining us live from Brussels to discuss possible sanctions against Burundi by the EU.